Theme 6: Bhakti Sufi traditions, changes in religious beliefs and devotional text. 8th to 18th century. We saw in chapter 4 that by the mid-first millennium CE, the landscape of the subcontinent was dotted with a variety of religious structures, stupas, monasteries, temples. If these typified certain religious beliefs and practices, others have been reconstructed from textual traditions including the Puranas, many of which received their present shape around the same time, and yet others remain only faintly visible in textual and visual records. New textual sources available from this period include composition attributed to poet saints, most of whom express themselves orally in regional languages used by ordinary people. These compositions, which were often set to music, were compiled by disciples or devotees, generally after the death of the poet saint. What is more, these traditions were fluid. Generations of devotees tended to elaborate on the original message and occasionally modified or even abandoned some of the ideas that appeared problematic or irrelevant in different political, social, or cultural contexts. Using these sources thus poses a challenge to historians. Historians also draw on hagiographies or biographies of saints written by their followers or members of the religious sect. This may not be literally accurate but allow a glimpse into the ways in which devotees perceived the lives of these path-breaking women and men. As we will see, these sources provide us with insights into a scenario characterized by dynamism and diversity. Let us look at some elements of this more closely. A 12th century bronze sculpture of Manikabachakar, a devotee of Shiva, who composed beautiful devotional songs in Tamil. 1. A mosaic of religious beliefs and practices. Perhaps the most striking feature of this phase is the increasing visibility of a wide range of gods and goddesses in sculpture as well as in text. As at one level, this indicates the continued and even extended worship of the major deities Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess, each of whom was visualized in a variety of forms. The integration of cults. Historians who have tried to understand these developments suggest that there were at least two processes at work. One was a process of disseminating Brahmanical ideas. This is exemplified by the composition, compilation, and preservation of Puranic text in simple Sanskrit verse, explicitly meant to be accessible to women and Sudras, who were generally excluded from Vedic learning. At the same time, there was a second process at work, that of the Brahmanas accepting and reworking the beliefs and practices of these and other social categories. In fact, many beliefs and practices were shaped through a continuous dialogue between what sociologists have described as great Sanskritic Puranic tradition and little tradition throughout the land. One of the most striking examples of this process is evident at Puri, Orissa, where the principle of deity was identified by the 12th century as Jagannatha, literally the Lord of the world, a form of Vishnu. A great and little tradition. The terms great and little traditions were coined by a sociologist named Robert Redfield in the 20th century to describe the cultural practices of peasant societies. He found that peasants observed rituals and customs that emanated from dominant social categories including priests and rulers. This he classified as part of a great tradition. At the same time, peasants also followed local practices that did not necessarily correspond with those of the great tradition. This he included within the category of little tradition. He also noticed that both great and little tradition changed over time through a process of interaction. While scholars accept the significance of these categories and processes, they were often uncomfortable with the hierarchy suggested by the terms great and little. The use of quotation marks of great and little is one way of indicating things. Jagannatha, extreme right, with his sister Subhadra center and his brother Balarama left. If you compare figure 6.2 with figure 4.26 chapter 4, you will notice that the deity is represented in a very different way. In this instance, a local deity whose image was and continues to be made of wood by local tribal specialists was recognized as a form of Vishnu. At the same time, Vishnu was visualized in a way that was very different from that in other parts of the country. Such instances of integration are evident amongst goddess cults as well. Worships of the goddess, often simply in the form of a stone smeared with ochre, was evidently widespread. These local deities were often incorporated within the Puranic framework by providing them with an identity as a wife of the principal male deities. Sometimes they were equated with Lakshmi, the wife of Vishnu, in other instances with Parvati, the wife of Shiva. Figure 6.3 sculpture of a Buddhist goddess Marichi, 10th century Bihar, an example of the process of integration of different religious beliefs and practices. Difference and conflict. Often associated with the goddess were forms of worship that were classified as tantric. Tantric practices were widespread in several parts of the subcontinent. They were open to women and men, and practitioners often ignored differences of caste and class within the ritual context. Many of these ideas influenced Shaivism as well as Buddhism, especially in the eastern, northern, and southern parts of the subcontinent. All of these somewhat divergent and even disparate beliefs and practices would come to be classified as Hindu over the course of the next millennium. The divergence is perhaps most stark if we compare Vedic and Puranic tradition. The principal deities of the Vedic pantheon, Agni, Indra, and Soma, become marginal figure, rarely visible in textual or visual representation, and while we can catch a glimpse of Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddesses in Vedic mantras, these have little in common with the elaborate Puranic mythologies. However, in spite of these obvious discrepancies, the Vedas continued to be revered as authoritative. Not surprisingly, there were sometimes conflicts as well. Those who valued the Vedic tradition often condemned practices that went beyond the closely regulated contact with the divine through the performance of sacrifices or precisely chanted mantras. On the other hand, those engaged in tantric practices frequently ignored the authority of the Vedas. Also, devotees often tended to project their chosen deities, either Vishnu or Shiva, as supreme. Relations with other traditions such as Buddhism or Jainism were also often fought with tension if not open conflict. The tradition of devotion or bhakti need to be located within this context. Devotional worship had a long history of almost 1,000 years before the period we were considering. During this time, expressions of devotion ranged from the routine worship of deities within temples to ecstatic adoration, where devotees attained a trance-like state. The singing and chanting or devotional composition was often a part of such modes of worship. This was particularly true of the Vaishnava and Shaiva sects. Discuss. Find out about gods and goddesses worshipped in your town or village. Nothing their names and the ways in which they are depicted. Describe the ritual that were performed. Comment this. To poems of prayer, early traditions of bhakti. In the course of evolution of these forms of worship, in many instances, poet saints emerged as leaders around whom there developed a community of devotee. Further, while Brahmanas remained important intermediaries between gods and devotees in several forms of bhakti, this tradition also accommodated and acknowledged women and the lower castes, categories considered ineligible for liberation within the orthodox Brahmanical framework. What also characterized traditions of bhakti was a remarkable diversity. At a different level, historians of religion often classify bhakti traditions into two broad categories: saguna with attributes and nirguna without attributes. The former included traditions that focused on the worship of specific deities such as Shiva, Vishnu, and his avatars, incarnations, and forms of the goddess or Devi, all often conceptualized in anthropomorphic form. Nirguna Bhakti, on the other hand, was worship of an abstract form of God. The Alvars and Nayanars of Tamil Nadu, some of the earliest Bhakti movements, the 6th century, were led by the Alvars, literally those who are immersed in devotion to Vishnu, and Nayanars, literally leaders who are devotees of Shiva. They travel from place to place singing hymns in Tamil in praise of their gods. During their travels, the Alvars and Nayanars identified certain shrines as abodes of their chosen deities. Very often large temples were later built at these sacred places. This developed a center of pilgrimage. Singing composition of these poet saints become part of temple rituals in the shrines and did worships of the saints' images. So on the Chaturvedin, Brahmana versed in the four Vedas and the outcast. This is an excerpt from a composition of an Alvar named Tondradipati, who was a Brahmana. You, Vishnu, manifested basically like those servants who express their love for your feet though they may be born outcast more than the Chaturbadins, who are strangers and without allegiance to your services. Do you think Chandradipati was opposed to the caste system? Comment this. Attitudes towards caste. Some historians suggest that the Alvars and Nainars initiated a movement of protest against the caste system and the dominance of Brahmanas, or at least attempt to reform the system to some extent. This is corroborated by the fact that Bhaktas hailed from diverse social backgrounds ranging from Brahmanas to artisans and cultivators, and even from castes considered untouchable. The importance of traditions of the Alvars and Niners was sometimes indicated by the claim that their composition were as important as the Vedas. For instance, one of the major anthologies of composition by the Alvars, the Nalaira Dibraprabandham, was frequently described as the Tamil Veda, thus claiming that the text was as significant as the four Vedas in Sanskrit that were cherished by the Brahmanas. Shastras or devotions. This is a verse composed by Appar, a Nainar saint, O Ragas, who covered the law books. Of what use are your Gotra and Kula? Just bow of Marperu's lord Shiva, who resides in Marperu, in Thanjavur, Tamil Nadu, as your sole refuge. Are there any similarities or differences in the attitudes of Chandradipati and Appar towards Brahmanas? Comment this. Women devotees. Perhaps one of the most striking features of this tradition was the presence of women. For instance, the composition of Andal, a woman Alvar, were widely sung and continue to be sung to date. Andal saw herself as the beloved of Vishnu. Her verses expressed her love for the deity. Another woman, Karaikal Amayar, a devotee of Shiva, adopted the path of extreme asceticism in order to attain compilation of devotional literature. By the 10th century, the composition of the 12 alvars were compiled in an anthology known as the Nalaira Dibbaprabandham, 4,000 sacred composition. The poems of Appar, Sambandar and Sundarar from the Tevaram, a collection that was compiled and classified in the 20th century on the basis of the music of the song. Her goal, her composition were preserved within the Nayanar tradition. These women renounced their social obligation but did not join an alternative order or become nuns. Their very existence and their composition posed a challenge to patriarchal norms. A demon. This is an excerpt from a poem by Karaikal Ammayar in which she describes herself, the female Pei, demoness, with bulging veins, protruding eyes, white tears, and sunken stomach, red-haired and jutting teeth, lengthy spine extending till the ankles, shouts and wails while wandering in the forest. This is the forest of Alankatu, which of the home of Father Shiva, who dances with his matted hair thrown in all eight directions and with cool limbs. Lays the ways in which Karaikalamayar depicts herself as presenting a contrast to traditional notions of feminine beauty. A 12th century bronze image of Karaikal Amayar. Relations with the state. We saw in chapter 2 that there were several important chiefdoms in the Tamil region in the early first millennium CE. From the second half of the first millennium, there is evidence for state, including those of the Pallavas and Pandas, say 6th to 9th centuries, while Buddhism and Jainism had been prevalent in the region for several centuries, drawing support from merchant and artisans communities. This religious tradition received occasional royal patronage. Interestingly, one of the major themes in Tamil Bhakti hymns is the poet's opposition to Buddhism and Jainism. This is particularly marked in the composition of the Nayanars. Historians have attempted to explain this hostility by suggesting that it was due to competition between members of other religious traditions for royal patronage. What is evident is that the powerful Chola rulers 9th to 13th century supported Brahmanical and Bhakti tradition, making land grants and constructing temples for Vishnu and Shiva. In fact, some of the most magnificent Shiva temples, including those at Chidambaram, Thanjavur, and Gangaikonda Cholapuram, were constructed under the patronage of Chola rulers. This was also the period when some of the most spectacular representations of Shiva in bronze sculpture were produced. Clearly, the vision of the Nayanars inspired artists. Both Nayanars and Alvars were revered by the Bhelalla peasant. Not surprisingly, ruler tried to win their support as well. The Chola kings, for instance, often attempted to claim divine support and proclaim their own power and status by building splendid temples that were adorned with stone and metal sculpture to recreate the visions of this popular saint who sang in the language of the people. These kings also introduced the singing of Tamil Shaiva hymns in the temples under royal patronage, taking the initiative to collect and organize them into a tavern. Further inscriptional evidence from around 945 suggests that the Chola ruler Prantaka I had consecrated metal image of Appar, Sambandar and Sundarar in a Shiva temple. These were carried in procession during the festival of the saints. An image of Shiva as Nataraja. Discuss why do you think kings were interested in proclaiming their connection with Bhaktas? Comment this. The Virashaiva tradition in Karnataka. The 12th century witnessed the emergence of a new movement of Karnataka led by a Brahmana named Basavana. (1106–68), who was a minister in the court of a Kalachuri ruler. His followers were known as Virasaivas, heroes of Saivas, or Lingayas, warriors of the Linga. Lingayas continues to be an important community in the region to date. They worship Shiva in his manifestation as a linga, and men usually wear a small linga in a silver case on a loop strung over the left shoulder. Those who were rewarded including the Jangama, or wandering monks. Lingaites believes that on death the devotee will be united with Shiva and will not return to this world. Therefore, they do not practice funerary rites such as cremation prescribed in the Dharmasastras. Instead, they ceremonially bury their dead. The Lingaites challenge the idea of caste and the past pollution attributed to certain groups by Brahmanas. They also question the theory of rebirth. This own them followers among those who are marginalized within the Brahmanical social order. The Lingaites also encourage certain practices disapproved in the Dharmasastras, such as post-puberty marriage and the remarriage of widows. Our understanding of the Virashaiva tradition is derived from Vachanas, literally sayings composed in Kannada by women and men who join the movement. Ritual and the real world. Here is a Vachana composed by Bashavana. When they see a serpent carved in stone, they pour milk on it. If a real serpent comes, they say, kill, kill. To the servant of the god who could eat if served, they say, go away. But to the image of the god which cannot eat, they offer dishes of food. Describe Vashavama's attitude towards ritual. How does he attempt to convince the listener? Comments. New religious development. The period also witnesses two major developments. On the one hand, many ideas of the Tamil Bhaktas, especially the Vaishnavas, were incorporated within the Sanskrit tradition, culminating in the composition of one of the best known Puranas, the Bhagavata Purana. Second, we find the development of traditions of Bhakti in Maharashtra in the 13th century. For religious ferment in North India. During the same period in North India, deities such as Vishnu and Shiva were worshipped in temples, often built with the support of rulers. However, historians have not found evidence of anything resembles the composition of the Alvars and Nayanars till the 14th century. How do we account for this difference? Some historians point out that in North India, this was a period where several Rajput states emerged. In most of these states, Brahmins occupied positions of importance, performing a range of secular and ritual functions. There seems to have been little or no attempt to challenge their position directly. At the same time, other religious leaders who did not function within the orthodox Brahmanical framework were gaining around. This includes the Naths, Yogis, and Siddhas. Many of them came from the artisanal groups, including Weber, who were becoming increasingly important with the development of organized craft production. Demand for such production grew with the emergence of new urban centers and long-distance trade with Central Asia and West Asia. Many of these new religious leaders questioned the authority of the Vedas and expressed themselves in language spoken by ordinary people, which developed over centuries into the ones used today. However, in spite of their popularity, these religious leaders were not in a position to win the support of the ruling elites. Fragments of a page from the Quran belonging to a manuscript dating to the 8th or 9th century. A new element in the situation was the coming of the Turks, which culminated in the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, 13th century. This undermined the power of many of the Rajput states and the Brahmanas who were associated with these kingdoms. This was accompanied by marked changes in the realm of sculpture and religion. The coming of the Sufis of culture and religion, the coming of the Sufi section 6 was a significant part of these developments. 5. New strands in the fabric Islamic tradition. Just as the regions with the subcontinent were not isolated from one another, so too, contact with lands beyond the seas and mountains had existed for millennia. Arab merchants, for instance, frequent ports along the western coast in the first millennia CE, while Central Asian peoples settled in the northwestern parts of the subcontinent during the same period. From the 7th century, with the advent of Islam, these regions become part of what is often termed the Islamic world. Ulama, plural of alim, or one who knows, or scholars of Islamic studies. As preservers of this tradition, they perform various religious, judicial, and teaching functions. Fates of rulers and subjects. One axis of understanding the significance of this connection that is frequently adopted is to focus on the religions of ruling elites. In 711, an Arab general named Muhammad Qasim conquered Sindh, which became part of the Caliph's domain. Later, in the 13th century, the Turks and Afghans established the Delhi Sultanate. This was followed by the formation of sultanates in the Deccan and other parts of the subcontinent. Islam was an acknowledged religion of rulers in several areas. This continued with the establishment of the Mughal Empire in the 16th century, as well as in many of the religious states that emerged in the 18th century. Theoretically, Muslim rulers were to be guided by the ulama, who were expected to ensure that they ruled according to the Shariah. Clearly, the situation was complicated in the subcontinent, where there were population that did not subscribe to Islam. It is in the context that the category of the Jimmi, meaning protected, derived from the Arabic word Jimma, protection, developed for people who followed revealed scriptures such as the Jews and Christians, and lived under Muslim rulership. They paid a tax called jizya and gained the right to be protected by Muslims. In India, this status was extended to Hindus as well. As you will see, chapter 9, rulers such as the Mughals come to regard themselves as emperors of not just Muslim but of all peoples. In effect, rulers often adopted a very flexible policy toward these subjects. For instance, several rulers gave land endowments and granted tax exemptions to Hindu, Jaino, Zoroastrians, Christians, Jewish, and religious institutions, and also expressed respect and Shariah, the Shariah and the law governing the Muslim community. It is based on the Quran and the Hadith tradition of the prophets, including a record of his remembered words and deeds. With the expansion of Islamic rules outside Arabia, in areas where customs and traditions were different, Qiyas, reasoning by analogy, and ijma, consensus of the community, were recognized as two other sources of legislation. Thus, the Saris evolved from the Qurans, Hadith, Qiyas, and Ijma. Devotions towards non-Muslim religious leaders. These grants were made by several Mughal rulers, including Akbar and Aurangzeb. A church in Khambat. This is an excerpt from a Farman imperial order issued by Akbar in 1598, whereas it raised our eminent and holy notice that the Padris, fathers of the Holy Societies of Jesus, wished to build a house of prayer church in the city of Khambat in Gujarat. Therefore, an exalted mandate in being issued that the dignitaries of the city of Khambat should in no case stand in their way, but should allow them to build a church so that they may engage themselves in their own worship. It is necessary that the order of emperor should be obeyed in every way. Who were the people from whom Akbar anticipated opposition to his orders? Comment this. A Mughal painting depicted Emperor Jahangir with a jogi. Reverence for the Jogi. Here is an excerpt from a letter written by Aurangzeb to Jogi in 1661 to 62, the possessor of the sublime station Shiv Murat Guru Anandanath Jio. May your reverence remain in peace and happiness ever under the protection of Sri Shiv Jio. A piece of cloth for the cloak and sum of 25 rupees which have been sent as an offering will reach your reverence. Your reverence may write to us whenever there in any service which can be rendered by us. Identify the deity you worship by the Jogi. Describe the attitude of the emperor towards the Jogi. Comment this. The popular practice of Islam. The developments that followed the coming of Islam were not confined to ruling elites. In fact, they permeated far and wide through the subcontinent amongst different social strata. Peasant, artisan, warrior, merchants, to name a few. All those who adopted Islam accepted in principle the five pillars of faith, that there is one God, Allah, and the Prophet Muhammad in his messenger, Shahada, offering prayer 5 times a day, namaz, salat, giving alms, zakat, fasting during the month of Ramadan, 7, and performing the pilgrimage to Makkah, Haji. However, the universal features were often overlaid with diversities in practice derived from sectarian affiliations, Sunni, Shias, and the influences of local customary practice of convert from different social millennia. For example, the Khojas, a branch of the Ismailis, a Shia sect, developed a new modes of communication, disseminating ideas derived from the Quran through indigenous literally genres. Indigenous literally genres. These included the Jinan, derived from the Sanskrit Janana, meaning knowledge. Devotional poems in Punjabi, Multani, Sindhi, Kutchi, Hindi, Gujarati, sung in special rags during daily prayers meeting. A Khojaki manuscript, Again and were transmitted orally before being recorded in the Khojaki script that was derived from the local Landa clipped mercantile script used by the linguistically diverse community of Khojas in the Punjab, Sindh and Gujarat. Elsewhere, Arab Muslim traders who settled along the Malabar coast, Kerala, adopted the local language Malayalam. They also adopted local customs such as matrilineal, chapter 3, and matrilocal residence. Matrilocal residence is a practice where women after marriage remain in their natal home with their children and the husband may come to stay with them. The complex blend of a universal faith with local tradition is perhaps best exemplified in the architecture of mosques. Some architectural features. A mosque in Kerala, 13th century, note the Sikhara-like roof. Of mosques are universal such as their orientation towards Mecca, evident in placement of the mihrab prayer niche and the minbar pulpit. However, there are several features that show variations such as roofs and building materials. See figure 6.9, 6.10 and 6.11. Figure 6.10, Atia Mosque, Mymensingh district, Bangladesh, built with bricks, 16.9. Names for communities. We often take the terms Hindu and Muslim for granted as labels for religious communities. Yet these terms did not gain currency for a very long time. Historians who have studied Sanskrit texts and inscriptions dating between the 8th and 14th centuries point out that the term Musalman or Muslim was virtually never used. Instead, people were occasionally identified in terms of the region from which they came, so the Turkish rulers were designated as Turuska. Tajika were people from Tajikistan, and Parasika were people from Persia. Sometimes terms used of other peoples were applied to the new migrant. For instance, the Turks and Afghans were referred to as Shakas, chapter 2 and 3, and Javanus, a term used for Greeks. The Shah Hamadan Mosque in Srinagar on the banks of the Jhelum is often regarded as the jewel in the crown. For all the existing mosques of Kashmir built in 1395, it is one of the best examples of Kashmiri wooden architecture. Notice the spire and the beautifully carved eaves. It is decorated with papier mâché. A more general term for these migrant communities were mlecho, indicating that they did not observe the norms on caste society and spoke languages that were not derived from Sanskrit. Such terms sometimes had a derogatory connotations, but they rarely denoted a distinct religious community of Muslims in opposition to Hindus. And as we saw, chapter 5, the term Hindu was used in a variety of ways, not necessarily restricted to a religious connotation. Discuss, find out more about the architecture of mosques in your village or town. What are the materials used to build mosques? Are they locally available? Are there any distinctive architectural features? Comment this. The growth of Sufism. In the early centuries of Islam, a group of religious-minded people called Sufis turned to asceticisms and mysticisms in protest against the growing materialisms of the caliphate as a religious and political institution. They were critical of the dogmatic definition and scholastic method of the interpreting the Quran and Sunnah tradition of the Prophet, adopted by the theologians. Instead, the laid emphasis on seeking salvation through intense devotion and love for God. By following his command and by following the example of the Prophet Muhammad, whom they regarded as a perfect human beings, the Sufis those sought an interpretations of the Quran on the basis of the personal experience. Sufism and Tasawwuf. Sufism is an English word coined in the 19th century. The word used for Sufism in Islamic texts in Tasawwuf. Historians have understood these terms in several ways. According to some scholars, it is derived from shub means wool, referring to the coarse woolen clothes worn by Sufis. Others derived it from safa, meaning purity. It may also have been derived from sufa, the platform outside the Prophet's mosque, where a group of close followers assembled to learn about the faith. Khanqahs and silsilas. By the 11th century, Sufism evolved into a well-developed movement with a body of literature on Quranic studies and Sufi practices. Institutionally, the Sufis began to organize communities around the hospice or Khanqahs, Persians, controlled by a teaching master known as Sheikhs in Arabic, Pir or Mursid in Persian. He enrolled disciplines murids and appointed a successor Khalifa. He established rules for spiritual conduct and interaction between inmates as well as between laypersons and the masters. Sufi silsilas began to crystallize in different parts of the Islamic world around the 12th century. The word silsila literally means a chain, signifying a continuous link between master and disciple, stretching as an unbroken spiritual genealogy to the Prophet Muhammad. It was through this channel that spiritual power and blessing were transmitted to devotees. Spiritual rituals of initiations were developed in which initiated took an oath of allegiance, wore a patch garment, and shaved their hair. When the sheikh died, his tomb shrine, dargah, a Persian term meaning court, became the center of devotion for his followers. They encouraged the practice of pilgrimage or ziyarat to his grave, particularly on his death anniversary or our marriage, signifying the unions of his soul with God's. This was because people believed that the dead saints were united with God and were thus closer to Him than when living. People sought their blessing to attain material and spiritual benefit, thus evolved the cult of the Sheikh, revered as Wali. Names of silsilas. Most Sufi lineages were named after a founding figure. For example, the Qadri order was named after Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jailani. However, some like the Chishti orders were named after their place of origin. In this case, the town of Chist in central Afghanistan. Wali plural Aulia or friends of gods was a Sufi who claimed proximity to Allah, acquiring His grace barakat to perform miracles karamat. Outside the Khanka, some mystic initiated movements based on a radical interpretations of Sufi ideas. Many scorned the Khankas and took to mendicancy and observed celibacy. They ignored rituals and observed extreme forms of asceticism. They were known by different names: Kalandars, Madaris, Malangs, Haidaris, etc. Because of their deliberate defiance of the Sharias, they were often referred to as B-Sharias, in contrast to the Ba-Sharia Sufis who compiled with it. Discuss: are there any khankas or dargahs in your town or village? Find out when these were built and what are the activities associated with them. Are there other places where religious men and women meet or live? Comment this. 7. The Chistis in the subcontinent. Of the groups of Sufis who migrated to India in late 12th century, the Chistis were the most influential. This was because they adapted successfully to the local environment and adopted several features of Indian devotional traditions. Life in the Chisti Khankas. The Khankas was the central of social life. We know about Sheikh Nizamuddin's hospice. 14th century, on the banks of the river Jamuna in Ghaziapur, on the outskirts of what was then the city of Delhi. It comprised several small rooms and the big hall, Jamaat Khana, where the inmates and visitors lived and prayed. The inmates included family members of the Sheikh, his attendants, and disciples. The Sheikh lived in a small room on the roof of the hall where he met visitors in the morning and evening. A veranda surrounding the courtyard and the boundary wall ran around the complex. On one occasion, fearing a Mongol invasion, people from the neighboring areas flocked into the Khankas to seek refuge. Major teachers of the Chist Silsila: Sufi teachers, years of date, locations of Dargah. Sheikh Muinuddin Chist Sijji, 1235, Ajmer, Rajasthan. Khawa Kutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, 1235, Delhi. Sheikh Fariuddin Ganji Sakhar, 1265, Ajodhan, Pakistan. Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, 1325, Delhi. Sheikh Nasiruddin Chirag Delhi, 1356, Delhi. There was an open kitchen, langar, run on Futu Anaks for charity. From morning till late night, people from all walks of life, soldiers, slaves, singers, merchants, poets, travelers, rich and poor, Hindu Jogi and Kalandar came seeking disciplineships, amulets for healing, and the intercessions of the Sheikh in various matters. Other visitors included poets such as Amir Hassan Sijji and Amir Khusru, and the court historian Ziauddin Baruni, all of whom wrote about the Sikh practices that were adopted, including bowing before the Sheikh, offering water to visitors, shaving the heads of initiated, and joking exercises represented attempt to assimilate local tradition. Sheikh Nizamuddin appointed several spiritual successors and deputed them to set up hospices in various parts of the subcontinent. As a result of the teaching practices and organisms of the Chishti, as well as the fame of the Sikh, spread rapidly. This in turn drew pilgrimage to his shrine and also to the shrine of his spiritual ancestor. The story of Data Ganj Baks. In 1039, Abul Hassan al-Hujuri, a native of Hujur near Ghazni in Afghanistan, were forced to cross the Indus as a captive on the invading Turkish army. He settled in Lahore and wrote a book in Persian called Kashf-ul-Mahjub, Unveiling of the Veiled, to explain the meaning of Tasawwuf and those who practiced it, that is the Sufi. Hujwiri died in 1073 and was buried in Lahore. The grandson of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni constructed a tomb over his grave, and this tomb shrine became a site of pilgrimage for his devotees, especially on his death anniversaries. Even today, Hujwiri is revered as Data Ganj Baks, or giver who bestows treasures, and his mausoleum is called Data Darbar, or court of the giver. Chishti devotionalism, Ziarut and Qawwali. Pilgrimage called Ziarut to tomb of Sufi saint is present all over the Muslim world. The practice is an occasion for seeking the Sufi spiritual grace, barakat. For more than 7 centuries, people of various creeds, classes, and social backgrounds have expressed their devotion at the dargahs of the 5 great Chishti saints. See charts on page 154. Amongst these, the most revered shrine is that of Khaja Mainuddin, popularly known as Garib Nawaz, comforter of the poor. The earliest textual reference to Khaja Mainuddin's dargah date to the 14th century. It was evidently popular because of the austerities and piety of its sake, greatnesses of his spiritual successors, and the patronage of royal visitors. Muhammad bin Tughlaq ruled 1324 to 51 was a 17th century painting of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia and his disciple Amir Khusru. Describe how the artist differentiated between the Sheikh and his disciples. Comment this. First Sultan to visit the shrine, but the earliest construction to house the tomb was founded in the late 15th century by Sultan Ghiyasuddin Khilji of Malwa. Since the shrine was located on the trade route linking Delhi and Gujarat, it attracted a lot of travelers. By 16th century, the shrine had become very popular. In fact, it was the spirited singing of pilgrims bound for Ajmer that inspired Akbar to visit the tomb. He went there 14 times. sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, to seek blessing for new conquest, fulfillment of vows, and the birth of sons. They maintained this tradition until 1580. Each of these visits was celebrated by generous gift, which was recorded in imperial document. For example, in 1568, he offered a huge cauldron dig to facilitate cooking for pilgrimage. He also had a mosque constructed within the compound of the dargah. Sheikhs greeting the Mughal Emperor Jahangir on the pilgrimage to Ajmer, painting by an artist named Manohar, say 1615. Find his signature on the painting. Comment this. The pilgrimage of the Mughal princess Jahanara, 1643. The following is an excerpt from Jahanara's biography of Sheikh Mainuddin Chishti, titled Munis al-Raha, the confidant of spirits. After praising the one God, the lowly fakira, humble soul, Jahanara went from the capital Agra in the company of my great father Emperor Shah Jahan towards the pure region of incomparable Ajmer. I was committed to this idea that every day, in every situation, I would perform 2 cycles of optional prayer. For several days I did not sleep on a leopard skin at night. I did not extend my feet in the direction of the blessed sanctuary of the river Saving Master, and I did not turn my back towards him. I passed the days beneath the trees. On thus the 4th of the blessed month of Ramjan, I attained the happiness of pilgrimage to the illuminated and the perfume topped, with an hour of daylight remaining. I went to the holy sanctuary and rubbed my pale face with the dust of the threshold. From the doorway to the blessed dome I went barefoot, kissing the ground. Having entered the dome, I went around the light-filled tomb of my master 7 times. Finally, with my own hand, I put the finest quality of ether on the perfume top of the revered one, and having taken off the rose scarf and I had on my head, I placed it on the top of the blessed tomb. What are the gestures that Jana records to indicate her devotion to the Sheikh? How does this suggest that the Dargah was a special place? Comment this. The lamp of the entire land. Its Sufi shrines were associated with distinctive features. This is what an 18th century visitor from the Deccan, Dargah, Qali Khan, wrote about the shrine of Nasiruddin Chiragi Dilli in his Murakkai Dilli album of Dilli. The Sheikh in the grave is not the lamp of Delhi, but the entire country. People turned up there in crowd, particularly on Sunday. In month of Diwali, the entire population of Delhi visit it and stays in tents around the spring tanks for days. They take baths to obtain cures from chronic disease. Muslim and Hindu pays visit in the same spirit. From morning till evening, people come and also makes themselves busy in merrymaking and shades of the trees. Also parts of Ziarut is the use of music and dance, including mystical chants performed by specially trained musicians or qawwals. to evoke divine ecstasy. The Sufis remember God either by reciting the zikr, the divine names, or evoking His presence through sama, literally audition, or performance of mystical music. Sama was integral to the Chistis and exemplified interaction with indigenous devotional tradition. Amir Khusru and the Call. Amir Khusru 1253 to 1335, the great poet, musician, and discipline of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, gave a unique form of the Chishti Sama by introducing the call. Arabic word means saying, a hymn sung at opening or closing of Qawwali. This was followed by Sufi poetry in Persian, Hindavi or Urdu, and sometimes using words from all of these languages qawwals. Those who sing these songs at the shrines of Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia always start their recital with the call to the qawwalis performed in shrines all over the subcontinent. Qawwali at Dargah of Nizamuddin Aulia. Languages and communications. It was not just in Sama that the Chishti is adopted local languages. In Delhi, those associated with the Chishti silsila conversed in Hindavi, the language of people. Other Sufis such as Baba Farid composed verse in the local language which were incorporated in the Guru Granth Sahib. Yet others compose long poems or masnavis to express ideas of divine love using human love as an allegory. For example, the Prem Akhyan love story, Padmavat, composed by Malik Muhammad Jaisi, revolved around the romance of Padmini at Ratan Sen, the king of Chittor. Their trials were symbolic of the soul's of journey to the divine. Such poetic compositions were often recited in hospices, usually during summer. A different genre of Sufi poetry was composed in and around the town of Bijapur, Karnataka. These were short poems in Dakhini, a variant of Urdu, attribute of Chishti Sufis who lived in this region during the 17th and 18th century. These poems were probably sung by women while performing household chores like grinding grains and spinning. Other compositions were in the form of lurinama or lullabies and sadinama or weddings songs. It is likely that the Sufis of this region were inspired by the pre-existing Bhakti tradition of the Kannada Bachanas, of the Lingayats and the Marathi Abhangs, of the saints of Pandharpur. It is through this medium that Islam gradually gained a place in the village of the Deccan. Charkhanama, a song set to the rhythm of the spinning wheel. As you take the cotton, you do jikar-e-jali. As you separate the cotton, you should do jikar-e-kalbi. And as you spool the thread, you should do jikar-e-aini. And jikar should be uttered from the stomach through the chest and threaded through the throat. The thread of breath should be counted one by one. O sister, up to 24,000 do this day and night and offer this to your peer as a gift. In what ways are the ideas and modes of expression used in the song similar to or different from those used by Jahanara to describe her ziyarat? Source 7. Comment this. Sufis and the states. A major feature of the Chishti tradition was austerity, including maintaining a distance from the worldly power. However, this was by no means a situation of absolute isolation from political power. The Sufis accepted unsolicited grants and donations from the political elites. The sultans in turn set up charitable trusts, wakaf, as endowments for hospices and granted tax-free land inam. The Chishtis accepted donation in cash and kind rather than accumulated donation. They performed to use this fully on immediate requirements such as food, clothes, living quarters, and rituals necessities such as sama. All these enhance the moral authority of the Sikhs, which in turn attracted people from all walks of life. Further, their piety and scholarship and people beliefs in their miraculous power made Sufis popular among the masses those support king wished to secure. Kings did not simply need to demonstrate their association with Sufis, they also required legitimation from them. When the Turks set up the Delhi Sultanate, they recited the instances of the ulama of imposing sharif, a state law, because they anticipated opposition from their subjects, the majority of whom were non-Muslim. The sultans then sought out the Sufis, who derived their authority directly from gods and did not depend on jurists to interpret the sharifs. Besides, it was believed that the awliya could intercede with God in order to improve the material and spiritual condition of ordinary human beings. This explains why kings often wanted their tomb to be in the vicinity of Sufi shrine and hospice. However, there were instances of conflict between the sultans and the Sufis. To assert their authority, both expected that certain ritual be performed, such as prostration and kissing of the feet. Occasionally, the Sufi sheikh was addressed with high sounding titles. For example, the disciplines of Nizamuddin Auliya addressed him as Sultan ul Masaiks, literally Sultan among Sikhs. Sufis and the state. Other Sufis such as the Shurawardi under the Delhi Sultan and the Naqshbandi under the Mughal were also associated with the state. However, the modes of their association were not the same as those of Chistis. In some cases, Sufis accepted courtly offices. Declining a royal gift. The excerpt from the Sufi text describes the proceeding at Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya's hospice in 1313. I, the author, Amir Hassan Sijji, had the good fortune of kissing his Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya's feet. At this time, a local ruler had sent him the deed of ownership to 2 gardens and much land, along with the provisions and tools for their maintenance. The ruler had also made it clear that he is relinquishing all his right to both the gardens and land. The master had not accepted that gift. Instead, he had lamented, "What have I to do with gardens and fields and lands? None of our spiritual masters had engaged in such activity. Then he told an appropriate story. Sultan Ghiyasuddin, who at the time was still known as Ulugh Khan, came to visit Sheikh Fariduddin and offered some monkey and received it for 4 villages to the Sheikh, the monkey being for the benefit of the dervishes Sufis, and the land for his use. Smiling Sheikh al-Islam Fariduddin said, "Give me the monkey, I will dispense it to the dervishes. But as for those land deeds, keep them. There are many who long for them. Give them away to such persons." The Dargah of Sheikh Salim Chishti, a direct descendant of Baba Farid, constructed in Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's capital, symbolized the bond between the Chishti and the Mughal state. What aspect of the relationship between the Sufis and the state do you think are best illustrated in this account? What does the account tell us about the modes of communication between the Sikh and his disciples? Comment this. 8 new devotional paths, dialogues, and dissent in northern India. Many poets engaged in implicit and implicit dialogues with this new social situation, ideas, and institutions. Let us now see how this dialogue found expression. We focus here on 3 of the most influential figures of the time. The One Lord. Here is a composition attributed to Kabir. Tell me, brother, how can I there be no one Lord of the world but two, who led us to astray? God is called by many names, names like Allah, Ram, Karim, Kesab, Hari, and Hazrat. Gold may be shaped into rings and bangles. Is not it gold all the same? Distinction are only words or invent. Kabir says they are both mistaken. Neither can find the only Ram. One kills the goat, the other cows. They waste their lives in disputations. What is Kabir's argument against the distinction made between gods of different communities? Comment this. Weaving a divine fabric, Kabir. Kabir, the 14th 15th centuries in perhaps one of the most outstanding examples of a poet saint who emerged within the context. Historians have painstakingly tried to reconstruct his life and times through a study of composition attributed to him as well as later hagiographies. Such exercises have proved to be challenging on the numbers of counts. Verses ascribed to Kabir have been compiled in 3 distinct but overlapping traditions. The Kabir Bijak is preserved by the Kabir Panth, the path or sect of Kabir, in Varanasi and elsewhere in Uttar Pradesh. The Kabir Granthawali is associated with the Dadu Panth in Rajasthan, and many of his compositions are found in the Adi Granth Sahib. This section 8.2. All this manuscript compilation, 19th century anthologies of verses attributed of him circulated in print in religions as far apart as Bengal, Gujarat, and Maharashtra. Kabir's poems have survived in several languages and dialects, and some are composed in the special language of Nirguna poets, the Sant Bhasha. Others, known as Alat Bansi, upside down saying, are written in form in which everyday meaning are inverted. This hints at the difficulties of capturing the nature of the ultimate reality in word expressions such as the lotus which blooms without flowers, or the fire raging in the ocean convey a sense of Kabir's mystical experience. Also striking is the range of tradition Kabir drew on the describe the ultimate reality. This includes Islam. He described the ultimate reality as Allah, Khuda, Hazrat, and Pir. He also used terms Darwan, drawn from Vedantic tradition, Alak, the unseen, Nirakar, formless, and Brahman, Atman, etc. Other terms with mystical connotations such as Shabda, sound, or Shunna, emptiness, were drawn from yogic tradition. Diverse and sometimes conflicting ideas are expressed in this poem. Some poems draw on Islamic ideas and use monotheism and iconoclasm, the attack Hindu polytheism and idol worship. Others use the Sufi concept of zikr and ishq, love, to express the Hindu practice of Nam Sankirtan, remembrance of God name. Were all these composed by Kabir? We may never be able to tell with certainty, although scholars have tried to analyze the language, style, and content to establish which verses could be Kabir. What this rich corpus of verses also signifies is that Kabir was and is to the present a source of inspiration for those who question entrance religious and social institutions, ideas, and practices in their search for the divine. Roadside musician, a 17th century Mughal painting, it is likely that the composition of the saints were sung by such musicians. Just as Kabir's ideas probably crystallized through dialogues and debate, spelled or implicit, which with the tradition the Sufis and Yogis in the region of Awadh, part of present-day Uttar Pradesh, his legacy was claimed by several groups who remembered him and continue to do so. This is most evident in later debates about whether he was a Hindu or a Muslim by birth. Debates that are reflected in hagiographics, many of these were composed from the 17th century onwards, about 200 years after Kabir's lifetime. Hagiographics within the Vaishnava tradition attempted to suggest that he was born a Hindu, Kabir Das. Kabir itself in an Arabic word meaning great, but was raised by a poor Muslim family belonging to the community of the Weber or Julahas, who were relatively recent converts to Islam. They also suggested that he was initiated into bhakti by Guru, perhaps Ramananda. However, the verse attributed to Kabir used the words Guru and Satguru, but do not mention the name of any specific preceptor. Historians have pointed out that it is very difficult to establish that Ramananda and Kabir were contemporaries without assigning improbably long life to either or both. So while tradition linking the two cannot be accepted and face value, they show how important the legacy of Kabir was for later generations. Baba Guru Nanak and the sacred words. Baba Guru Nanak 1469-1539 was born in the Hindu merchant family in a village called Nankana Sahib near the river Ravi in the predominantly Muslim Punjab. He trained to be an accountant and studied Persian. He was married at a young age, but he spent most of his time among Sufi and Bhaktas. He also traveled widely. The message of Baba Guru Nanak is spelled out in his hymns and teaching. This suggests that he advocated a form of Nirguna Bhakti. He firmly repudiated the external practice of the religions he saw around him. He rejected sacrifice, ritual births, image worships, austerities, and the scriptures of both Hindus and Muslims. For Baba Guru Nanak, the absolute or Rab had no gender or form. He proposed a simple way to connect to the divine by remembering and repeating the divine name, expressing his ideas through hymns called Shabad. In Punjabi, the language of the region, Baba Guru Nanak would sing this composition in various ragas while his attendant Mardana played the rabab. Baba Guru Nanak organized his followers into a community. He set up rules for congregational worship, Sangat, involving collective recitation. He appointed one of his disciples, Angad, to succeed him as the preceptor's guru. And this practice was followed for nearly 200 years. It appears that Baba Guru Nanak did not wish to establish a new religion, but after his death, his followers consolidated their own practices and distinguished themselves from both Hindus and Muslims. The fifth preceptor's Guru Arjun compiled Baba Guru Nanak's hymns along with those of his four successors and other religious poets like Baba Farid, Ravidas, also known as Raidas, and Kabir in the Adi Granth Sahib. These hymns called Guru Bani, all composed in various languages in the late 17th century. The 10th preceptor's Guru Gobind Singh included the composition of the 9th Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, and scriptures are called the Guru Granth Sahib. Guru Gobind Singh also laid the foundation of the Khalsa Panth, army of the pure, and defined its five symbols uncarved here: a dagger, a pair of swords, a comb, and a steel bangles. Under him, the community got consolidated as a socio-religious and military force. Mirabai, the devotee princess. Mirabai, 15th-16th centuries, is perhaps the best-known romance poet within the Bhakti tradition. Biographies have been reconstructed primarily from the bhajanas attributed to her, which was transmitted orally for centuries. According to this, she was a Rajput princess from Mirta in Marwar, who was married against her wishes to Prince of the Shishodia clan of Mewar, Rajasthan. She defied her husband and did not submit to that traditional role of wife and mother, instead recognizing Krishna, the avatar of Vishnu, as her lover. Her in-laws tried to poison her, but she escaped from the palace to live as a wandering saint, composing songs that are characterized by intense expressions of emotions. A 15th century stone sculpture Tamil Nadu depicting Krishna playing the flute, a form of the deity worship by Mirabai. Love for the Lord. This is a part of song tribute to Mirabai. I will build a funeral pyre of sandalwood and aloe. Light it by your own hand when I am burned away to cinders. Smear this ash upon your limbs. Let flame be lost in flames. In another verse he sings, what can mirror roofs do to me? If God is angry, all is lost. But what can the runner do? What does that indicate about Mirabai's attitude towards the king? Comment this. According to the same tradition, her preceptor was rather a leather worker. This would indicate her defiance of the norms of caste society. After rejecting the comforts of her husband's place, she is supposed to have donned the white robe of a widow or the saffron robe of the renouncer. Although Mirabai did not attract a sect or group of followers, she has been recognized as a source of inspiration for centuries. Her songs continue to be sung by women and men, especially those who are poor, considered low caste in Gujarat and Rajasthan. Shankaradeva. In the late 15th century, Shankaradeva emerged as one of the leading proponents of Vaishnavism in Assam. His teachings, often known as the Bhagavati Dharma, because they were based on the Bhagavad Gita and the Bhagavata Purana, focused on absolute surrender to the supreme deity, in this case Vishnu. He emphasized the need for Nam Kirtana, recitations of the names of the Lord in Sat Shanga, or congregations of pious devotee. He also encouraged the establishment of shatra or monasteries for the transmission of spiritual knowledge, and Namghar or prayer halls. Many of these institutions and practices continue to flourish in the region. His major compositions include the Kirtana Ghosha. Discuss: why do you think the tradition of Kabir, Baba Guru Nanak and Mirabai remain significant in the 21st century? Comment this. 9. Reconstructing histories of religious traditions. We have seen that historians draw on a variety of sources to reconstruct histories of religious traditions. Those include sculpture, architecture, stories about religious perception, composition, attribute to women and men engaged in the quest of understanding the nature of divine. As we have seen in chapter 1 and 4, sculpture and architecture can only be understood if we have a grasp of the contents, the ideas, beliefs, and practices of those who produce and use those images and building. What about textual traditions? Regarding religious beliefs, if you return to the sources in this chapter, you will notice that they include a wide variety written in several different languages and styles. They range from the apparently simple, direct language of the Bachanas of Bashavana to the ornate Persian of the Farman of the Mughal empires. Understanding each type of text requires different skill apart from the familiarity with several languages. The historian has to be aware of the subtle variation in style that characterize each genre. Varieties of sources used to reconstruct the history of Sufi tradition. A wide range of texts are produced in and around Sufi campus. This includes 1. Treatises or manuals dealing with Sufi thought and practices. The Khas-ul-Mahjub of Ali bin Usman Hujwiri, died 1071, is an example of this genre. It enables historians to see how tradition outside the subcontinent influenced Sufi thought in India. 2. Malfuzat, literally uttered conversions of Sufi saints and early text, and Malfuzat is the Fawaid al-Fawad, a collection of conversions of Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya, compiled by Amir Hassan Sijji Dalawi, a noted Persian poet. Source 9 contains an excerpt from this text. Malfuzats are compiled by different Sufi silsilas with the permission of the sects.
This had obvious didactic purpose. Several examples have been found from different parts of the subcontinent, including the Deccan. They were compiled over several centuries. 3. Maktubat, literally written, collection of letters written by Sufi masters addressed to their disciplines and associated. While this tells us about the Sheikh's experience of religious truth and that he wanted to share with others, they also reflected an life condition of the recipients and our responses to their aspirants and difficulties, both spiritual and mundane. The letter, known as Maktubat Imam Rabbani, of the noted 17th century Naqshbandi Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, the 1624, whose ideology is often contrasted with the liberal and non-sectarian views of Akbar, are amongst those most frequently discussed by scholars. 4. Tazkiras, literally to mention and memorialize. Biographical accounts of saints. The 14th century Siwarul Awliya of Mir Khurat Kirmani was the first Sufi tazkira written in India. It dealt principally with the Chishti saints. The most famous tazkira is the Akbar ul Akhir of Abdul Haq Muhaddis Dalhabi. Date 1642. The authors of the tazkiras often sought to establish the precedence of their own orders and glorify their spiritual genealogies. Many details are often implausible, full of the elements of the fantastic. Still, they are of great value of historians and help them to understand more fully nature of the tradition. Remember that each of tradition where we have been considering in this chapter generated a wide range of textual and oral modes of communication, some of which have been preserved, many of which have been modified in the process of transmission, and others are probably lost forever. Virtually all these religious traditions continue to flourish to date. The continuity has certain advantages for historians as it allows them to compare contemporary practices with those described in textual tradition or shown in old paintings and to trace changes at the same time, because these traditions are part of people's lived beliefs and practices. There is often a lack of acceptance of the possibility that this may have changed over time. The challenge for historians is to undertake such investigation with sensitivity while at the same time recognizing that religious traditions, like other traditions, are dynamic and change over time. Timeline. Some major religious teachers in subcontinent. See 500 to 800 C. Appar Sambandar Sundarmurti in Tamil Nadu. See 800 to 900 Namalvar Manikavachakar Andal Tondradipodi in Tamil Nadu. See 1000 to 1100 Al Hujiwari Dataganj Baks in the Punjab and Ramanujacharya in Tamil Nadu. See 1100 to 1200 Bashavara in Karnataka. 1200 to 1300 Janadeva Muktavai in Maharashtra. Khaja Mainuddin Chishti in Rajasthan. Bhai Uddin Jakaria and Fariuddin Ganj e Sakhar in the Punjab. Kutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki in Delhi. 1300 to 1400 Lal Ded in Kashmir. Lal Savaj Kalandar in Sindh. Nizamuddin Aulia in Delhi. Ramananda in Uttar Pradesh. Chakmela in Maharashtra. Sarafuddin Yaya Manedi in Bihar. C 1400 to 1500 Kabir Raidas Surdas in Uttar Pradesh. Baba Guru Nanak in the Punjab, Ballabacharya in Gujarat, Abdullah Sattari in Gwalior, Muhammad Shah Alam in Gujarat, Mir Sayyid Muhammad Ghesu, Daraj in Gulbarga, Shankar Deva in Assam, and Tukaram in Maharashtra. C 1500 to 1600, Sri Chaitanya in Bengal, Mirabai in Rajasthan, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Gangai, Malik Muhammad Jalsi, Tulsidas in Uttar Pradesh. C 1600 to 1700, Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi in Haryana, Mian Mir in the Punjab. This times note frames indicate the approximate period during which these teachers lived. Answer in 100 to 150 words. Comment this. Write a short essay about 250 to 300 words on the following. Comment this. Map work. On an outline map of India, plot 3 major Sufi shrines and 3 places associated with temples, one each of the form of Vishnu, Shiva and the goddess. Do this. Comment this. Projects. Choose one. Choose any 2 of the religious teachers, thinkers, saints mentioned in this chapter and find out more about their lives and teaching. Prepare a report about the area and the times in which they lived, their major ideas, how we know about them, and why you think they are important. Comment this. Find out more about practices of pilgrimage associated with the shrines mentioned in this chapter. Are these pilgrimages still undertaken? When are these shrines visited? Who visited these shrines? Why do they do so? What are the activities associated with this pilgrimage? Comment this. The Dargah of Sheikh Bahauddin Zakaria, Multan, Pakistan.